Good evening. I hope everyone's having a great day. Welcome to Faith Uncensored. I am Don Sheaver, and tonight is just an open forum for questions. So if you haven't seen in the chat, just a quick welcome. And if you put a Q and a colon before whatever your question is, it makes it a lot easier for me to find it in the chat because sometimes our chat can get busy, and so it makes it a little bit easier for me to be able to search and find it with a Q and a colon. That being said, no questions are off limits. You're welcome to ask whatever you want, and the only thing that we request is that you are kind, generous, compassionate, merciful, and nice to people in the background. Sorry, I just got message that the music is a little loud, so let me just get rid of that. If that is better, please let me know in the chat. And so please feel free to ask whatever questions that you have. I am going to pour myself a drink while we wait for the first questions to start rolling in. It's starting to feel like winter here, not just the darkness, but actually it was pretty cold out today. And over the weekend, we had quite a bit of flurrying the one day. It never really amounted to much more than flurries. But nonetheless, the first real indication that winter is here. So it's been an interesting couple weeks, midterm elections. I think that there's been a lot with that. Conversations happening on our YouTube channel. A lot of people asking questions about hell and about sin and stuff. And so we're able to, is the extra time so he can find a Cavs shirt. You know, I do not have a Cavs shirt on tonight. I know. I apologize to the Cleveland Cavaliers. They depend on me to wear my Cleveland Cavaliers stuff. It's an unpaid sponsorship that I have. So so Fifth Sunday, you alluded to me that you had some questions that you've been saving up. So I would love to hear what one or all of those questions are. Maybe not at once, but feel free to throw one of those questions in the chat. Love to have them. But yeah, so this week's been some interesting conversations happening. I've been doing some reading. David Gushee is going to be on the show this coming Thursday, who has written a plethora of books. I think, if I'm correct, it's around 30 books. And he's going to be on the show on Thursday. So come on there and you can ask him questions. He is he was considered Evangelical's leading ethicist for quite some time until he moved towards a more inclusive approach to faith and the LGBTQ community. And that began the end of his career. I'm sure he could talk about that better than I can, speaking about it on his behalf. But a wonderful human being. I've had the opportunity to meet him a couple times now, and I'm really looking forward to him being on the show. So I've been reading a few, going back through a couple of his books so I could rookie numbers. Yes, total rook. But I've been going back through a couple of his books to make sure that I have a sense of questions to ask him and some things to talk about. So I've had a lot on my plate this week. I don't know about you guys. How have you been? But a lot going on here. So, all right. Any questions? Are you guys going to make me get to the picker wheel early? Let's see here. Well, I'm going to spin. Someone throws a question in there. It might save us from all the pain of having to deal with this, but we're going to go with it. Does God hate? That is a good one. So I'm kind of curious what you all think. Like, how would you answer that if someone asked you that? I do hate the wheel. I hate the wheel tremendously. Oh, I seem kind of quiet. Hold on, let me make sure I have the right mic going. Let's see here. I've been having some audio issues the last week or so. I might need to undo everything and re-put everything together. Is it? Are you able to hear okay, or is it just kind of quiet? I can turn it up a little bit. Keep me posted in the chat so I make sure it's at a good volume. So this is an interesting question. Does God hate? And I think we had a similar question to this at the end of the episode, maybe even last episode, about does Jesus hate me? Um, and clearly, this is something that's on a lot of people's minds. If both these questions are in the top questions on search uh, sites such as Google, Bing, whatever, and it seems as though this one carries particularly a particular weight, right? And I think part of it is because in a lot of Christian churches, we have set God and Jesus against each other in some ways, right? That God is cruel, God is judgmental, God is willing to punish, and Jesus, in some way, comes to our defense and stands between us and God, keeping God's rage from being taken out on us. And because of that, I think a lot of people do have a sense of that God hates. And if it wasn't for Jesus, God would just let the whole earth burn. I think that's a really, really sad and disappointing outcome of the teaching that has happened in the church. I would argue, one, if you hold the view that Jesus is God incarnate, then you can't have Jesus against God. You just can't. It doesn't work. Either Jesus is God or Jesus is not God. Um, and so I think that that's one of the pieces. I think the other thing is, and this goes back to the discussion I was having this week with some people online about hell, is a God that is willing to torture people for eternity for not saying a prayer in a certain way or for not behaving or thinking a certain way, regardless of circumstances, that this God would torture that individual for eternity seems pretty hateful. And so, because of that, I think a lot of people, particularly I would say people who are against religion, against Christianity, against theology, and or anti-theist or non-theist, would look and say, "How could you serve a God that despises people so greatly?" So, as far as I'm concerned, no, I do not see in the text a God that hates us, hates people. I don't even see a God in the text that hates people that don't believe in them. There's all kinds of stories of God bringing about peace or well-being or salvation, if you will, to peoples that had nothing to do with um, Judaism or Christianity. So yeah, I think probably the easy answer is no. God doesn't. God does not hate, unless you want to go to the place of God hates, you know, sin. But I'm not even sure that that's true. So, uh, yeah. So there you have it. This is why I don't like going to the wheel. I'm telling you. And but there we are. That's what we had. So, uh, Marcus, did you teach on the woman at the well yesterday, or are you teaching on the woman at the well next week? All right. Throw your questions in the chat, or I will once again force you all to endure me attempting to answer questions from the wheel. And keep me posted when it comes to my mic and or music. I'm not sure. I want to make sure that my audio is okay for all of you. I was really relieved that over the last week or so, I was really worried that there was going to be quite a bit of violence when it came to the elections, that there was going to be a lot of um, outpouring of anger and from either side. And instead, it seems that we had a relatively safe and quiet election. And even those who have lost have seemed to have accepted the loss as of right now. So all of that seems good and well. All right, folks, it's your fault. You forced me into it. I'm gonna have to do the wheel again. All right, let's see what we got. Hopefully it's better than Does God Hate? All right, this is an easy one. So why do you underscore the word of God, or the name, the word God, sorry. So that's a relatively easy one. It is a Jewish um, tradition that you don't write out the name of God. Now, God, God, is just a generic term. In a lot of Judaism, it has more to do with the tetragrammaton, the YHWH, that you don't spell that out. And one of the reasons you don't spell it out is because it should never be destroyed once it's spelled out. And so if you've ever been to a synagogue that has its own Torah scroll, that you will find, if they've ever had a Torah scroll from the past, that they actually will collect all the times that the name of God was used. They'll cut it out and store it, and then destroy the rest of the Torah scroll, because the name of God should never be blotted out, should never be struck out. And so because of that, they often will write like G_D, or write Hashem instead of writing God. And Christianity actually picked up that tradition, called Nomina Sacra. At least I believe that's Latin, and it's about the name being sacred. And so it's the tetragrammaton, Fifth Sunday. I feel like I do hate it more than you do. That's probably true. So, but anyhow, the reason I put an underscore is because even from the early days of Christianity, people wouldn't write out the name Jesus. They would take out the vowels. And so you would see JSS, or whatever Greek letters you would see, right? And again, it was a way to recognize that the name was sacred, and that when we say someone's name, it's important that we say it in the right context, in the right way, with the right health. And so that's an important piece, is for me, that there's something sacred about the name of God, and I want to be reminded of that when I type it. I want to think about that when I'm using it, that it's not just something that I say flippantly. Instead, there's actual value there. And though I am quite keen or capable of typing well, I'm not so good that that underscore is just easy muscle memory, at least not yet. And so I have to think about it even when I'm typing. I have to slow down when I write the name of God. And for me, I find that to be very, very meaningful and powerful. So, all right. All right. I think it's the correct mic, but you just seem quiet. I have to have you way louder than I have had previous weeks. All right. I will just try to speak up. Missed the first 5 minutes. I'm sorry. I'd say that God doesn't hate, but his followers do. Yeah, unfortunately, I think you're absolutely right with that. I think that is true. Marcus says, "Does God hate ideas, injustice, evil?" Yeah, it's interesting because I think that people, first of all, just giving God human emotions is a complicated thing to begin with, right? We don't we don't necessarily know what the emotions are of God. I think part of what makes us like God, that is discussed in Genesis 3 particularly, has to do with emotions. Um, but does God hate ideas? That's interesting. I mean, I don't think in general, but certain ideas maybe. Again, I'm just the word hate is kind of a strange term. Uh, does God hate injustice? I mean, I think you could make a case for that. Does God hate evil? Yeah, I think you could make a case for those. Again, I just think the idea of hate, um, I guess hate towards something that's not humans might be, because I don't think that God hates evil doers. I think God hates the evil that doers do, but uh, not evil. Sorry, evil doers, not evil. So maybe it's a hate the sin, not the sinner type thing. I don't know. I hate that phrase, by the way. Um, oh, you did teach it on Sunday morning. Good. I hope it went well. Uh, and I hope that it was received well. I'd love to hear more about it sometime. All right. I am not seeing any other questions. Please take a moment if you haven't already and hit the like button. That helps us. So, especially when we're live, if you hit the like button while we're live, that hits the algorithm for YouTube and we end up being pushed towards more people's pages. Especially when we are live, I'm very grateful for you hitting the like button. All right. I guess we are going. I'm going to clip Don Cheever saying, hate the sin, not the sinner. I Look, there's so many worse things I could be clipped for saying that I'll take that one. That'll be fine. All right. All right, all. I'm going back to the spinner. Here we go. Where's Ray with all the questions when you need him? Does the Bible condemn gambling? So I would say no. The Bible does not condemn gambling. The Bible is really has little to say about a lot of pieces, a lot of things, and so we infer that. Oh, I have a question. I overlooked it. Thanks, Paul. I'll get back to it. I'm going to answer this question first, and then I'll get back to it. All right. So, does the Bible condemn gambling? So, a lot of this is things that there just really wasn't gambling in the same way in ancient times that we have today, like casinos, etc. I'm sure that there were ways to bet on things. Wagers were made in different areas. And really, what it comes down to is if you're taking advantage of someone, that's wrong. If you are harming people because of your own gambling addiction, your own gambling desires, that's wrong. But gambling itself is not something that's wrong. In fact, I would argue, casting of lots was something that happened frequently in the Bible, where they would use chance to determine outcomes. And because of that, by dealing with chance or using chance to determine outcomes, it's the same thing as gambling. And let's be honest, we gamble every day of our life. It's just what we're wagering, right? Whether you're gambling that tonight's episode with me on live is going to be good, and therefore you're spending an hour and a half of your life listening to this, gambling that it's going to be of value to you, or you're gambling that the movie you're going to pay $20 to go see is actually good and worth the $20. So we're always gambling, and I don't think the Bible is concerned about that. I think the Bible is often or always concerned about the well-being or the outcome. and how does it impact the person who is doing the gambling? How does it impact the people in relationship with the person doing the gambling? And is the person doing the gambling doing it above board and with honor to the other people that are participating also in that? So I think that's kind of where I would go with that. So yeah, there you have it. All right, fifth Sunday. Why do you believe Abram was chosen and not Enoch? I don't know that I have an answer for that. I mean, why is anyone? Because God was gambling. Uh, it was a chance that God was taking. It's fascinating. I think I understand why you're asking the question. I imagine you're asking the question because it says Enoch walked with God, and then Enoch was no more because Enoch seemingly or in some way walked off with God in the story. And that's it's actually a really interesting question to ponder. I don't know if it's a question I can answer, right? Save it for Thursday. I have a feeling Gushy would feel similarly, right? Like that the question itself is intriguing, but it's unanswerable because I can't read the mind of God, and so therefore I don't know. It could have been timing because Enoch is not from this exact same generation as Abraham. It could have been that Abraham had a unique disposition to care for others, where maybe Enoch was a devoted person, but not maybe closer to Noah in the sense that Noah seemed to be more concerned about his own salvation than the world's salvation. I don't know. It's a fun thing to ponder, though. That's for sure. And if anyone in the chat has thoughts, I'd love to hear those. Isn't that a pastor's job? What, to read the mind of God? if I think a lot of pastors think it's their job or pretend like they're able to do it, which is really sad. In fact, I think there was a pastor, I think on Monday, before the midterms last Monday, who said that God told them that God had it under control and not to worry about the election and it was all going to be fine. And so because of that, like it's kind of funny that, it's being played and, so he's getting thrashed on all different kinds of sites and stuff. And there's part of me that kind of laughs because I go, well, I mean, technically you could say God did have it and this was the outcome that God wanted. I don't personally believe that. I don't believe God manipulates politics in the U.S. But yeah, so I'd like to hear you think out loud about polyamory from a Christian perspective. So polyamory, you know what? I'm going to get an exact definition. Only because it's exactly how I thought it was, but I wanted to make sure that it wasn't missing anything. So polyamory is the practice of engaging in multiple romantic and typical sexual relationships with the consent of all the people involved. So I don't know that I care that much. I know you weren't asking me necessarily about just my opinion. You're talking about the Christian perspective. I think that what we do is there's a great book by Richard Beck called, oh man, hold on, let me look it up. I think it's called like Unclean. Let's see. Yeah, it's called Unclean, and it's meditations on purity, hospitality, and mortality. And because of that book, let's see here. See if I can find a. So here is kind of like the front thing of the book. And in this book, he talks about how there are things that are gross to us or things that seem wrong that we then make a moral judgment about. And he begins the book with this really kind of interesting thing. He says, now think about saliva. He's like, now just, let it build up in your mouth, swallow it. He's like, that's saliva. We have no problem with that. He's like, but now take that same saliva, let it build up in your mouth, spit it out into a cup, and now drink it. And he's like, and all of a sudden it's gross. And you're like, oh no, I'm not doing that. But nothing has changed. The whole thing is the exact same. It was fine before you spit it out. And now the idea of putting it back in is you get grossed out. So I think what has happened with certain things around LGBT stuff is that there's a certain level of this that is just, for some people, a gross factor, right? Or it's a place from where someone who is not polyamorous but would love to have an affair views it or can only imagine it from a perspective of mischief or from a perspective of harm. And one of the things that you noticed in the definition that I put up there, let's see if I can put it back up real quick, is that it's with the consent of all people involved. I don't know that Christianity and or faith has anything really to say about this. I know that Paul says, to get married but he seems to only think you should get married if you can't stay single. And yeah, so I don't know. It's a really good question, Marcus. And honestly, I think that would be an interesting one to ask the ethicist on Thursday, David Gushy, what he thinks about it. I think that I think monogamy is the last kind of stronghold, even within progressive Christianity, that progressive Christianity is not interested in wrestling with. Just not I'm not even saying getting rid of, just not even interested in wrestling with it. It's like, nope, I'm okay with same-gendered relationships. I'm okay with any kind of queer relationship as long as it's monogamous. And so I think it's something that is still not ready to be wrestled with by the church, which I think is a shame. But I do believe that if the Bible was able to support someone such as Abraham, who had a polyamorous relationship, actually probably wasn't even polyamorous because we don't know that the servant that was given to him by Sarai was okay with the relationship. So we don't know what Hagar's feelings are on this. And so he's not even in a polyamorous relationship. He's in something less, potentially less caring, less loving, and yet still somehow he found his way to being one of the most just and hospitable people we see in the text. Yeah, it's something I've been going back and forth on, maybe sexual ethics in general, deeper questions than can I be gay and Christian? Yeah, I agree. I think that the church needs to step up and do that. And it needs to step up in a way that is discussion. It's not to make statements, like, right? Because one of the things I found that during the whole process of inclusion of the denomination I was a part of, there really was no interest in a dialogue. The only interest was, how do we make statements that argue our perspective? And so I think it would be really wonderful within Christendom if there were some polyamorous relationships that existed, which I know there are, polyamorous relationships that existed that were brought into a broader conversation around this. And I think it's important to do the same thing with as many different relationship types as we can find in order to have a dialogue about what is healthy, what is unhealthy, and who's determining that health, and on what standards are being used to determine that regard. And I think it would be a fascinating conversation that I would love to be a part of. But I'm not certain that the church as a whole is, but that the church as a whole is willing or interested. Like, can't you just, like, this is my impression of the church, including the progressive church, right? Probably even more so the progressive church. The church is kind of like, look, we just said yes to gayness. We just said yes to queer people. Like, do do we have to deal with polyamory too? Like, can't we have a break? Like, give us 2 decades to kind of celebrate this win before we all of a sudden have to wrestle with more questions. Like, that's how I feel the church behaves with this, as opposed to how beautiful and wonderful that we want to wrestle as a community about what it means to honor God in any type of relationship, and what does that mean. So Marcus says, find myself mulling the idea of polyamory, hookup culture, maybe even the idea of hooking up in general, and noting the way I feel about how I can bring my idea of God into it. Not sure. Yeah, I think hookup culture, I think polyamory, and you probably know this, Marcus, but polyamory, a polyamorous individual would be like, this is not hookup culture. This is not about having an orgy. This isn't about being a swinger. This is about the fact that I have the capacity to love someone in a partnership idea, right? In a partnership perspective that goes beyond just me and one other person. And that I can be in companionship and partnership with someone else for the rest of our lives and be just as committed to them as, for instance, like I am committed to my spouse, right? And that for them, it's just that they're able to, they feel that they can or desire to have that same level of commitment and trust and relationship, but just with more more than just one partner. So it's a it's a very interesting place. Um, the saliva image is great. It's really good. Richard Beck is phenomenal. Richard Beck also wrote a book um, on death. Let's see, what was it called? I think it was like slavery, um, the slavery of death. Yeah, there it is. So he also wrote this book. This book I highly recommend if you are someone who either wrestles with mortality, wrestles with like the idea of death. Does a phenomenal job, not so much just talking about mortality issues, but also what our fear of death has done to our desire to create legacy, and how our desire to create legacy has harmed us from living a very present life. It's really, really fascinating. Highly recommend it. Paul says, I'm not poly, but I have friends that are. It took me a little bit of processing, like it did for a lot of LGBTQ plus things for me, but I'm cool with it now. Yeah. We go about making statements on these issues like we're at the yes, very much so. And honestly, that's the thing that's so disappointing to me about church and about Christendom, is that we are more interested in being right than we are interested in helping people to feel healthy and be healthy. And so we would rather be right and create a doctrinal statement or a creed, and without wrestling with what are the circumstances that got someone here. What is behind this need, this desire, this whatever. And so I'm not just talking about sexuality here. I'm talking about anything, right? that the church should be excited that anytime someone brings something forward and says, how can this fit within Christianity? The church should be ecstatic about that question. The church should be thrilled to wrestle with, okay, let's sit down with the text, let's sit down with a history, and let's sit down with what it is that you're bringing forward. And let's see, how do we make these fit together? How do we wrestle these out? What are the compromises that are end up being made in order to make it fit? And are those compromises more harmful than exclusion? And there might not even be compromises, but if there are compromises, are those compromises more healthy to make by the church, compromised by the church to allow certain things to happen or live within that space than the harm it would cause to exclude the person? I've been a part of churches that a couple will have children, be living together for 5 or 10 years, decide that they want to finally get married, finally, as if they, I don't mean it finally as in, oh, they finally are doing what's right, but they decide they want to get married after 5 or 10 years. And the church will say, you need to move out from each other and stay apart, and also no intimacy, no sexual intimacy until the wedding night. From here on out, if you want us to do the wedding, this is the requirements. So you're going to ask a family to break up the family, to break up the healthy intimacy potentially that is there, hopefully, right? And all for what? For grandstanding? Like, I mean, who's the church impressing there? God? I don't get it. I don't understand it. And honestly, it causes more harm than it does anything. We should be striving to reconcile things or redeem things, not looking to make sure it's perfect before we allow it to happen. All right. I'm probably a little behind on the comments. Sorry. Yeah, that's well said. Health versus unhealth. I find, especially in the affirming church, some Christians equate affirming means any and all behavior is awesome. And I'm not sure that's true. Well, and I think it's a pendulum swing, right? That, and part of this is fundamentalist mindset that has infiltrated affirming or more liberal or more progressive, however you want to say it, churches, is that fundamentalism seems to believe that they own the Bible. And so if you're going to be an affirming church, then you need to reject the Bible, or you can't use the Bible, or you're going to have to throw away a bunch of things from the Bible, or the Bible's not going to be as true, which is why I'm passionate about this project with Ancient Jesus Future Faith, is because I say, no, if you actually embrace the text and you embrace the setting in which it was written and you embrace the people in which it was written to, and you begin to understand that together as a whole, I believe deeply that most people are going to be moved or going to be compelled to being more affirming, more inclusive, more willing to fight for any of the marginalized communities. But the danger is that a lot of affirming communities are like, yeah, we're going to have to get rid of the Bible. Like, the Bible's antiquated. I've heard a lot of progressive pastors say to me that the Bible's antiquated and that they just don't really they like the Psalms. And that breaks my heart, because I don't think you need to throw out the Bible to be affirming. In fact, I would argue it was my study of the Bible that made me affirming. Fifth Sunday, I believe that those people just tolerate the change. They don't embrace it. Yeah. Also not sure that this is a societal moment that Christians really have any ground voice to comment on health versus unhealth in the LGBT world. We've sort of blown it. Yeah, I think that there's some truth to that, Marcus. I think the church should tread cautiously. I think that it's important that if the church is going to comment on LGBT health and unhealth of relationships, that it has to come from places where the pastor, the leader, is a known entity, ally, or member of the LGBT community, to really make any kind of ground-breaking work, right? And the LGBT community has really suffered at the hands of a few people like Eugene Peterson, which really breaks my heart because I love Eugene Peterson. But Eugene Peterson saying that he was inclusive for about 3 weeks until all his life went to shambles for saying it, and then flipped back and said, okay, no, I'm not inclusive anymore, because the pressure was too high. And the church has seen that enough. The church, or I'm sorry, not the church, the LGBTQ community has seen it enough that someone will come out and be supportive when it seems like it's safe to do so. But when the going gets tough, they quickly uh, bury their head again. And I think that that's such a it's such a shame, right? Because I think that the LGBTQ community is like, I don't trust anything the church has to say to me because I've been there, done that. I do remember the World Vision Week. I was blown away that World Vision would ever do something like that, and then I remember how quickly it changed back, and that was crushing to my soul. That discussion is what draws me most to AJFF. Well, that's very generous, and hopefully we'll keep drawing you and others because, listen, that's the thing. I really hope that those of you that are watching right now, or that you find this space to be a place to have an honest discussion about really big and important conversations and topics, and that you feel welcome to bring other people into this space, that they're going to be listened to. They're going to have their thoughts and their concerns wrestled with, and it be genuine and not just be shot down because the questions are hard, right? I'll tell you when I don't know. And I don't know a lot of the times, but I also am willing to have any one of those conversations because it has to happen. The church, as I have experienced it at times, and we can talk about the other experience I've had that have caused me trauma and need counseling, but the church that I have experienced that has given me a place to land and heal and be heard and be comforted, I still think the world wants that. I still think people crave that. The problem is that we've made an obstacle course now to get there, to experience that. And we should lead with that stuff, right? Like leave the obstacle course for later, if people want to do something more or something else. But don't make it an obstacle course to get to the healing place and the comforting place and the security place and the love place. Lead with that. That's what the world needs. The world needs us to lead with mercy, compassion, and justice, not lead with doctrines and dogma. Yeah. All right. Am I through all the questions? I'm happy to talk more on sexual ethics if people have more questions, because I do think the church doesn't, even the more conservative church does not teach biblical ethics. Biblical ethics would teach singleness, right? The evolution from marrying your rib to marrying your wife and then, or a spouse, and then having a servant given to you to also birth kids, to marrying siblings, to marrying like all of that stuff, that whole evolutionary process that we get to. And then people start saying, well, once Jesus came along, it was monogamous only. And then Paul comes along after Jesus and says, no, I tell you, remain single. And I'd be curious of the people listening to this, how many of you were raised in a church that emphasized you towards singleness, that didn't emphasize marriage, did not emphasize relationships, but emphasized singleness as the goal? Because that's what Paul says. And then if we look at Jesus's example seems to be singleness. So if we really want to talk sexual ethics in the text, why does not even the most conservative fundamentalist church preach towards singleness? Instead, they preach towards a heteronormative marriage where the male is the one in power. And that's what's taught. All right, sexual ethics. So, fifth Sunday, masturbation, go. I think that'll get me banned from YouTube. So instead, I'll just answer the question I think you're asking, which is masturbation okay? And the answer is yes. In fact, it's healthy. It's good for you. The Bible is silent about masturbation. The most that we can see is the brother who was given to his brother's wife as a levirate marriage, and instead of inseminating her, he pulled out and so did not get her pregnant, and so he was avoiding following the rule of levirate marriage. That's it. That's the only place that we really see it in the text, and I would argue it's important to recognize that it's okay, it's healthy, it's good. I think where people get twisted up in it is then they pull out Jesus's statement on lust and they want to make it that, well, you can't masturbate without lusting. And I would just argue Jesus is not talking about lust there. He is quoting the Septuagint statement on from the Ten Commandments and the Ten Commandment area, Exodus 20, of do not covet your neighbor's land, do not covet your neighbor's animals, do not covet your neighbor's servants, and do not covet your neighbor's spouse. So in that situation, you probably should not be having sexual lust towards the land or the animals, in general. So the idea of coveting there is specific to this idea of looking at what it is that your neighbor has, the blessings that your neighbor has, like a lot of land, or what your neighbor has that is, he has a large flock of animals, or that your neighbor married, or whatever it might be. And I believe what Jesus is getting at there is that if you don't look at other people and covet what they have that you feel like you don't have, then you're never going to commit adultery. So the best way to not commit adultery is to not covet what other people have. And that's what Jesus is getting at. It's the same way as when Jesus says, it's been written, do not murder, but I tell you, do not hate, right? Like, that's important because if you don't hate anyone, then you're not going to murder someone. If you can hit the mark of no hatred, it's going to be easy not to kill someone. In the same way, if you hit the mark of not coveting what other people have or what other people have gained or received in life, then you're not going to commit adultery. So, all right. In my varied circles, singleness was essentially ignored unless they were trying to talk about what LGBT ought to do instead of, yeah, it's the side B kind of idea, right? Yeah, I agree. Yep. All right. I think we're caught up again. What other questions do we have? If we need to, I can go back to the picker. The number of questions on it are getting smaller because I hide them every time I answer one. All right, let's see here. Perfect timing. It was God's will for us to talk about this. All right. Let's see. I had friends that felt pressured into relationships even though they had no interest in them. Yeah, Absolutely. I'm absolutely. Definitely a problem. All right, before we get to the transphobic question, I will take Fifth Sunday's question. Uh are there levels of coveting that are acceptable? Like I can look at my friend's spouse or girlfriend and be like, "Wow," but not want my friend's life. So, I think that there are ways that noticing that someone is attractive in whatever way that is, whether that's physically attractive, emotionally attractive, spiritually attractive, um, intellectually attractive, right? I mean, the list goes on, the ways that we are attracted to other human beings. And I would argue, for some reason, the only one that we tend to warn people about is when you're physically attracted to someone. Again, we all need to be careful and be smart about how we become attracted to people. Whether it's being attracted to the way someone thinks about things, it's a very powerful thing. There are lots and lots of professors that end up having affairs with students because a student would probably be attracted to the intellectual pursuit of the professor, right? So there's lots of ways that coveting happens that is not just physical appreciation. And I think it's important for us to take that into account, not to be scared of it, not to be afraid of it, but instead to make sure that we're aware that it exists. And if we find ourselves too invested in the other person, that we risk harming relationships, whether our own, whether whatever it might be, that you risk causing relationship issues with another person. And we need to be aware of that. I, when I was growing up, there was a book. Someone can probably come up with the name of it. I think maybe it was Man in the Mirror, something like that. But it was like, if you see an attractive woman coming towards you, bounce your eyes, like look away. And I was like, that is the most horrible thing in the world to teach people, because that means that eye contact will not be available and that you'll never actually learn how to treat this person as a human as opposed to an object. And so the problem isn't the objective beauty of someone, or the subjective beauty of someone. Instead, it's the object of the person that is important. And we need to find other ways to make sure that we are healthy. And let's just be honest, it just takes some halfway decent social skills to not harm other human beings that we find to be attractive in some way. It's not hard. It's not difficult. It's not complicated. It might be confusing for some people how to process those things, how to think about those things, but it's not difficult. And we need to teach our children how to engage people that they find attractive in whatever way, and do it in a manner that doesn't consume the other person or doesn't harm the other person in the process, and doesn't harm themselves in the process. And I think that this is a relatively simple thing to do. It's just that where I don't know why we don't do it. If you have a thought about why we don't do that, I'd love to hear it. But um, all right, let's see. I've heard it said you covet what your mind mulls on. When you're alone at night, are you still thinking about your neighbor's wife? Maybe not. That's not the healthiest thing for you. Yeah, I just think that a lot of times we're not even we're not even actually coveting our neighbor's significant other. What we're coveting is the idea of them, right? I mean, just go on Instagram and you're going to see that all these amazing lives that are out there. And I'm telling you, people are not living those amazing lives. They're staged. And in the same way, a lot of times the things that we covet are staged ideas that we actually we pick and choose what it is, and even in doing that, you dehumanize the other person, and you potentially cause harm to that other person, and so that's also important to be thinking about. All right, let's see. All right, to our question: is God transphobic? I would say God is not transphobic, and yeah, of course, Marcus, thanks for coming. I'd love to hear more about your teaching that you did. Can't wait. Thanks. So is God transphobic? I would say no. And I think that there's a lot of reasons to say no. I think one of the reasons to say no is that God is referred to in scripture both as the feminine and as the masculine. God is referred to as Adonai, which is a masculine reference to God, and God is referenced as El Shaddai, which is feminine, right? So one, it means Lord, and one means sacred breast or many breasted one. And so God is not concerned about being gendered. When God creates humankind, we don't know what God created, right? Like, say you take the creation narrative literally, and you believe that there is an Adam. When God created Adam, we don't know what that means, right? You can assume it was a guy, but why would God create a guy when there's no uh, second part to that, right? Um, and so, the rabbis, the sages, the teachers of ancient, they would say God created a human that had all the sexual components, right? Um, that intersex or hermaphrodite, right? That word has become harmful in more recent years, but intersex, and that this entity is what God created, and God said was very good. And it's not, this entity, this human was not male or female, and God said it was very good. And it wasn't until they were alone that they experienced aloneness that God said this is not good. In fact, the word rib doesn't mean rib. It can mean rib, but it just means side, that God made from the side of Adam Eve. And so a lot of the sages, rabbis imagine it that God kind of pulled this one entity that was both male and female, pulled it apart in order to create uh, two individuals in order for it to not be alone. And I think that that's significant for us to be thinking about. I also think it's important for us to remember that the first convert we see in Acts, the first convert we see after Pentecost is an Ethiopian eunuch who would have been a genderqueer individual in ancient times. They were either gay or they were castrated. Either way, they did not meet the gender norms, right? So when you hear people say mutilating genitals are in some way an affront to God, the first convert was either gay or had mutilated genitals. And let's be fair, most conservative Christians mutilate their sons' genitals by having them circumcised in Western culture. So this whole idea of God being transphobic just does not fit in the text. And the closest anyone can get to God being transphobic is where it says for women not to wear men's clothing. And this is about deceiving people, not about dressing in a manner that makes you feel comfortable or experience the fullness of life. This is about deceiving people. This is about trying to convince someone to behave differently in different circumstances. And I think that we even need to nuance that, because I think that there's a lot of people that dress a certain way in order to elicit safer responses for themselves or healthier responses. And so I don't think that passage really has much to do. And the irony there is that the same people that will point to that passage reject everything else in the Old Testament. They say the Old Testament doesn't matter unless it's convenient for their argument. So, why didn't God make both Adam and Eve the same? You mean like twins, or do you mean like at the same time? What exactly is it that you mean by why did God not make them the same? And just as to so we're clear on my stance on this, I do not believe that the Garden of Eden was a real place. I think it is a part of our faith tradition that is used parabolically to explain why we till the land, to talk about why we are in constant pursuit of God and God is in constant pursuit of us. So I think that much of Genesis, and I would argue much of Genesis leading up to Abraham, is to set the scene of how God tried many different ways and in many different actions to get the result that ended up being Abraham. And then that's why Abraham becomes the father of our faith, because Adam didn't work, Noah didn't work, Tower of Babel didn't work, but Abraham works. Abraham does it. And why does Abraham do it? Because Abraham is just, Abraham is hospitable, Abraham reflects God, unlike Adam, unlike Noah, unlike the Tower of Babel. So, so for me, the debate of Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, it's meaningless to me because I read this as a parable, not as a geographical location that somehow we've not been able to find. Okay, so the question is about why didn't God make both Adam and Eve the same gender? Again, since I don't believe that to be a scientifically true historical event, I think it's because that's the story that God created. I think that's how Israel comes to understand why there are multiple genders. So yeah, I don't have a great response to that. Sorry. All right. Any other questions? What do we got going? What are you folks thinking? It's 9:05. It's getting to be about that time where we start thinking about if we have a bunch of questions, we keep going through 9:30. If we're all kind of tired out and we've asked the questions we want to ask, we've gotten to the things we wanted to get to, that we can start to wind down the discussion. Please, I do want to remind you, David Gushee is going to be here Thursday night. I look forward to that. He is a Christian ethicist. He would be wonderful to ask a lot of these questions about sexual ethics in the Bible, about LGBT, about polyamory. All the things you were asking me tonight would be wonderful questions to be asked on Thursday and get to hear his perspective. And I'm also curious to hear his thoughts on those. So I might even bring some of them up. All right. What other questions we have, folks? Otherwise, I can spin the wheel. All right. Let's go to the wheel. The last question was pretty good. Why does God isolate you? All right. So this again is one of those ones where we kind of have to attempt to get into the mindset of the person who asks such a question. So clearly this is someone who feels isolated. Oh, somehow I captured run scene on there. I apologize. We have to get in the mind of the person asking it. So this is someone who feels isolated and in some way feels as though God is responsible for it. I would argue then that probably means bad teaching in your community, or bad leadership. If you feel isolated and you feel like it's because you offended God in some way, then someone is not teaching you a healthy hermeneutic for understanding community, understanding God, understanding faith. And I think that that's important for us to recognize. All right. Sorry, Paul. Our chat's a little bit slow tonight, so I was able to catch it. So it says in early Genesis, there's a point that it says people began calling on the name of the Lord. What point do you think that statement is making, either about us or God's relationship with us? So, so first of all, I think it's important to understand what is meant by name of the Lord, right? It's not just yelling out someone's name. It is about the character. And so that at some point early in Genesis, people started to call out to God, referencing God's character. We see Abraham do it. We see Moses do it. We see lots of people throughout the text do it, that they would call out upon the name of the Lord, saying, God, if you are a just God, you need to show up. God, if you are a just and merciful God, then you need to do these things, pointing out the suffering, pointing out the unwellness of what was going on, and calling out God's character. I think it's a very powerful and beautiful thing to say that they were calling upon the name of the Lord. I think we need to do that more. I think it's good for our own soul sometimes to call out God and be like, what is going on? This world is so harmful and unloving, and you are a God of justice and mercy. And where are you, and what are you doing, and why are you not here? I mean, that's the Psalms, right? The Psalms are filled with someone calling upon the name of the Lord, calling upon the character of the Lord. And so this is a moment in the text where we see people holding God accountable and saying, okay, God, the flood happened. You promised it was never going to happen again. Tower of Babel happened, and you distributed people all over the place. What are you going to do? How are you going to handle this situation? And so they started calling upon the name of the Lord. We think about that when we say call upon the name of the Lord. We think that if we insert Jesus or God as punctuation when we pray, so it's like Jesus, Lord, Jesus, God, please, Jesus, God, Lord, Jesus, that is what is meant by calling on the name of God. And I would argue it's not. When we finish a prayer and say, in the name of Jesus, I pray, what you're saying is, I just said a prayer that was in the character of Jesus. Well, we better be really careful when we say that. We should really think about what am I praying about? What am I praying for? What am I praying against? What am I saying in this prayer? And can I, with full confidence, indeed declare that this is in the character of Jesus or in the character of God? So I hope that helps. I think it's really important. I think it's actually very beautiful. It's extremely meaningful. In fact, I love that you even asked the question, because I think a lot of people, a lot of people just kind of skim over that and don't really wrestle with what does that mean, because we just assume we know what it means. Because people all the time pray in the name of Jesus and just literally mean that they addressed it to Jesus, and or that they're trying to command Jesus to do their bidding, which can be really weird. And I've been a part of those types of prayers too, where you threaten God. You're like, you said where two or more are gathered, and like we threaten God that God better do something because of that. I think that there's room to hold God accountable. So I know I might sound like I'm talking out both sides of my mouth. I think there's one thing to treat God like a genie, and another thing to say, God, you made promises, and I'm asking you to keep them. So I hope that helps, Paul. I don't know that that's extremely satisfying, but off the top of my head, without having looked at that in a while. That's what I would say is happening there. All right. While someone's thinking about the next great question, I'm going to spin the wheel again. Why does Jesus ask Peter, "Do you love me?" So this is one that I don't feel like a huge amount of confidence to answer the way that I think it should be answered. And that goes because in that passage where Jesus basically asks the question 3 times, it's after the resurrection. Peter sees Jesus on the shore eating some fish or frying up some fish for breakfast, goes out to Jesus, goes over to Jesus on the shore, and Jesus asks Peter 3 times if he loves him. I believe this is in the book of John. And I can tell you that the word love there changes from philia, which is brotherly love, to it's not eros love. But the language about love changes. Agape. So it changes from agape to philia or vice versa. And this is why I don't feel completely confident to talk on this question, is because I'd want to look at the passage again. It's been so long. But basically Jesus is getting at, like, what, when you say love, what do you mean? Right? And this just goes in also in tradition with Peter and Jesus, like 3 things happening to Peter before the cock crows 3 times. Jesus being or Peter being asked 3 times if he loves Jesus. So this just goes along with some of the don't want to necessarily call them tropes, but some of the parts about Peter and Jesus's relationship of 3 things happening. So this is important because Jesus is trying to ensure that Peter's ready, I think, to lead, because he was the main disciple and he's going to have to lead the way forward. And the only way I think Jesus imagines that that's going to be done well or healthy is if Peter trusts what he's learned from Jesus. So I think that's why. But again, I'd want to study that one out a little bit more. All right, folks, 9:15. I don't see any other questions in the chat. I'll give you a moment or two to do that. But while you are thinking about whether or not you're going to ask another question, again, reminder, this Thursday, David Gushee. We are looking to have other writers, scholars, authors, thinkers on Thursday nights. Hopefully we'll be consistent and do that on Thursday nights, do our Q&A on Mondays, and start filling in most Thursday nights with people that you can all come on and ask questions of. And we really want to get a wide intersection of thinkers and personalities. But the main thing that I experienced growing up in the church and growing up and being interested in thinking about these things was that I never really had the opportunity to ask anyone the questions I was having. So it was great. I could read their book, but book tends to be a one-way conversation, if you know what I mean, right? So like I'd read their book and I'm like, okay, but I have questions and I would love to have access to these people. And oftentimes we don't. And so the goal and the hope is that over the next several months that we will slowly begin to have more and more of these people on the live stream so you can ask them questions. And so that we can start having some dialogue with some of these thinkers who are then writing the textbooks and creating the ideas that are being taught in our seminaries that then our pastors come and use on the pulpit to shape the church. And sometimes we don't even get to ask our pastors questions, much less the people that influence them. And so this is an opportunity for you to have that access to ask some questions of people that probably have influenced your pastor in some way, or at least pastors in your denomination. And so, yeah, So I really encourage you, come hang out with us, do that. I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be wonderful. And I have a couple other people, hopefully, that will be on shortly, that will announce them as we get time set with them. But I think you'll be really excited about some of the people we have coming up in the near future. So I don't see any questions out there. I think we got everything. So it's 9:15. I think we're going to bug out about 15 minutes early tonight. I really appreciate you all being here. This is so much fun as always. Thank you for asking questions. Tonight's questions were, I think, really important questions that a lot of times we don't ask in church, because it's weird to talk about sex. It's weird to talk about sexual ethics, and honestly, we're not always sure that we're going to get an honest response, I think, sometimes. So thank you for those questions. They were wonderful. And I really appreciate all of your time tonight. So love you guys. I hope you have a good evening. I'll see you Thursday.